الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد باب الجماعة the chapter of the Jama'ah or congregation as we call it والجماعة سنة مؤكدة the congregation is a sunnah mu'akkada for the obligatory prayers and those prayers which are like obligatory prayers. That basically just includes the Taraweeh in Ramadan and the Witr afterwards. So Witr throughout the year, there's no Jama'ah for it. There's only Jama'ah for Witr in Ramadan after the Taraweeh and it's Sunnah Muqtada. Right, so basically no Jama'ah for any source of Nafil, Tahajjud or غيره. Now, Sunnah Muqtada قريب من الواجب. So it's almost wajib, not 100%. It's not a wajib like witr, for example, but it's close to it, right? Some even say that it's farz. For example, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, rahimahullah ta'ala, he used to say that Jama'ah was not just sunnah muakkada, it was actually farz wa ayn, compulsory on every person, every male person at least, to attend Jama'ah, and if they missed on purpose, their salah would have been unacceptable. Right? And the benefits of the Jama'ah are immense. For example, the Prophet Islam he said, صلاة الرجل في جماعة تزيد على صلاته في بيته وصلاته في سوقه بضعا وعشرين. That a person's prayer in the congregation exceeds this prayer in his house, and also his prayer that he does in his workplace by 25 or in some traditions 27 times, right? And so this hadith tells us that the Jama'ah is not for us. Because it says that a person's prayer in his home alone, that prayer is exceeded by a prayer done in Jama'ah. If praying alone was impermissible in the first place, he wouldn't have suggested the fact that the Salah of congregation has more ajr to it. Anyhow, the fact that Sunnah Muakkada means that in some cases where there is an udhr, where there is an excuse, uh, the hukum of the salah also is foregone. For example, in the case of extreme rain where a person can't get to the masjid, or if there's like a blizzard outside and you can't actually go, right? And maybe sometimes you need to go to the restroom so bad that you won't be able to complete the entire salah. Or maybe there's a war going on outside, or maybe the government's just blocked the roads for whatever valid reason. If a person cannot attend the Jama'ah, then they won't be held accountable for it. Now we talk about Imama, leading the congregational prayer. Now there are few conditions that must be met, first of all, in order for a person to lead the prayer. And then there are wujuh tarjih, reasons for preference on who should the people choose as their imam, right? So the conditions Sahib al-Quduri does not mention, they include, first of all, al-bulugh, that person must be an adult. Children cannot lead the congregational prayers. I mean, if it's only a congregation of just children, in order to build their habits, practice, and all these other things, it's okay. But adults, at least, cannot be led by children in prayer. So that's number one. It's Quduri. Number two is obviously it's Islam, because prayer is an ibadah, and acts of ibadah from a non-Muslim are not acceptable. So such a person can also not lead a prayer in which behind him stand Muslimin. The third is aql. So a majnoon, an insane person, cannot lead the prayer for a number of very good reasons. If he's insane, he probably does not know what to recite, when to recite, how to recite. Uh, Issues with their tahara, for example. You can never trust them to actually ever complete salah. The fourth is uh, being a dhukura, being male. So females, if it's a mixed congregation, both male and female, then they can't lead that salah, right? So the Prophet Islam, he mentioned, أَخِرُوهُنَّ مِنْ حَيْثُ أَخَّرَهُنَّ اللَّهُ. Place them where Allah has placed them. And so when the sufuf are being made, the row of the women is kept behind the row of the men, right? And in the time of the Prophet Islam, no woman led the men in congregation. And so because of that, a dhukura is a condition in a mixed congregation or an all-male congregation. If it's all females, then obviously a female can do the imamah. And the last condition is, or actually the fifth condition is, uh, knowing enough Quran that is sufficient for the salah to be valid. If a person doesn't even know one verse, one ayah of the Quran, maybe they're a newly accepted Muslim, then at that point they can't lead the prayer. So you should need to know enough Quran in order to establish a valid prayer. So that means the person must know Surah Al-Fatiha and at least three verses other than that. And the last condition is for the Imam to be in perfect health, no udhr. And basically what that means is the Imam should be able to perform the ruku and sujood. He should not be praying through signs, through gestures. So that what means the Imam being in health to be able to lead. Because if the Imam can't pray other than gestures, then he cannot lead those people who can actually perform the ruku and sujood. Now these were the conditions necessary in order for a person to qualify as an Imam, right? But obviously we have a lot of people who meet these conditions. Who should we be giving preference to? That's what he talks about and says, وَأَوْلَى النَّاسِ بِالْإِمَامَةِ أَعْلَمُهُمْ بِالسُّنَّةِ. The most worthy people of leading a jama'ah are number one, the most knowledgeable of them in Sunnah. And by knowledgeable in Sunnah, we mean the Sunan of Salah. So the Imam must be the most knowledgeable in the Masail of Salah, because that's what he's actually doing, right? So it's possible he doesn't know anything about financial transactions. He's not an expert in that. There may be others behind him who are. He might not be an expert in inheritance questions, right? But because that's not of our concern at this moment, our concern are only prayers. So the first person being given preference should be the one most knowledgeable in the Sunan of Salah, in the Masail and Ahkam of Salah. But in Tasawo, and if you find people who are equal in that respect, second thing you look at, فَأَقْرَأُهُمْ, The best of them in reciting the Quran. And by best of them in reciting the Quran, we don't mean just their beauty of their voice. What we actually mean is the tajweed, right? So best of them in reciting the Quran refers to best of them in tajweed. So it's possible you could have a really coarse voice. Maybe even you can't stand it, right? But if your tajweed is on the spot, then you qualify as an imam. On the other hand, if you have someone who has a really beautiful voice, but their tajweed isn't up to par, then they aren't the first one who shouldn't be the first ones to get selected. Well, if someone has both tajweed and really good voice, nurun ala nur, that would be the best. But over here, when we say aqra'uhum, the best in reciting the Quran, we refer to in terms of tajweed. فَإِن تَسَاوَوْا, and if they're equals in that respect as well, their knowledge in the Sunnah of Salah is the same, their recitation in terms of the tajweed is the same, then you need to look at فَأَوْرَعُهُمْ, uh, the most scrupulous of them, the one with the most taqwa amongst them, should be the one chosen for this position. And by taqwa, we don't mean the one who performs the most nafil salawat or recites the most Quran, right? By this kind of taqwa, we actually mean someone who takes good care of halal and haram and even abstains from shubuhat, things that are doubtful, right? And his mu'amalat with the people, his dealings with the people are all clean. People are willing to trust him, right? He doesn't cheat, he doesn't deceive. And so these things are more in line with the taqwa we're talking about. So awra means tawarru'. Tawarru' is a higher form of your normal taqwa that we talked about. So it's like a high level taqwa, which not includes mostly nafil ibadat and adhkar and ad'iyah, as most people would come to think. But tawarru' means to abstain from the doubtful as well. Abstain from the doubtful in their consumption and in their dealings with people. فَإِن تَسَاوَوْا, and if miraculously they're equal in this aspect as well, فَأَسَنُّهُمْ, then the eldest amongst them should be given the lead. Now, the fuqaha in longer commentaries have mentioned even more wujuh. For example, if in some case they're also equal in age, then who should be selected and then who should be selected? There's like more than 50 things. Some of them are extremely senseless things as well. I don't know where they got those ideas from. Yet, usually you'll find amongst these 4 or 5 characteristics where you can decide who should the person be that should lead you in prayer. But again, remember, these are just uh, aspects aspects of preference. They're not necessary conditions. So it's possible you could have someone lead you, and they may not be the most knowledgeable in the Sunan of Salah, or they may not have the best of the Tajweed, or maybe they're not as muttaqi, as mutawarri' as some other people in your group. The prayers are still valid and they're still acceptable, inshallah ta'ala. Now, when you know the types of people who you should put forward for leading the prayers, now you can talk about people who you should avoid keeping them forward in prayer. وَيُكْرَهُ تَقْدِيمُ الْعَبْدِ. It is disapproved to give priority as an imam to a slave. The reason being, a slave is usually busy with the service of his master. He doesn't have the time to actually learn the ilm, get the ilm that might be required for this. That means if the master actually makes sure that his slave gets the proper education in shara, in fiqh, and stuff like that, then there is no problem in presenting the slave forward. Wal Arabi, a Bedouin, a person from the village, they shouldn't be put forward, lead the prayer. Two reasons: the same, that بعد عن مجالس العلم, that first of all, you don't get so many chances for acquiring ilm in the villages as you would do in the city. So for most Bedouin people, a state of ignorance is prevalent. That's number one. And number two, their language or their tones are not that refined, especially if they're not Arab people, they're Bedouin from other countries and other tribes. Uh, the recitation, they have recitation problems as well. The talaffuz of the alfaz and how to pronounce words unfamiliar to them, they have more difficulty than the people of uh, urban areas do. Wal fasiq, a fasiq, a dissolute person, should also not be given priority. He should also not be placed forward, right? Because a fasiq is a person who does not take care, give importance or priority to his deen, right? And so a person who is doubted in his deen will result in people not wanting to pray behind such a person. So this could potentially lead uh, to a reduction in the number of people who want to join the congregation. وَوَلَدِ الزِّنَا, and the child of adultery. So a bastard should also not be put forward. Well, it's not the fault of this poor person. It was the fault of his parents that he's ended up in the States. The fact is that people uh, think less of such a person. عموما, uh, commonly people don't hold such a person in the high esteems, right? And so this could also potentially lead to a taqleel in jama'ah, a reduction in the number of people joining the congregation, right? And also because for such a person, the father is usually absent, which means that his tarbiyah uh, more will be affected, and also there might be a lack of education for him. So because of all of these aspects, it is makruh to actually put forward these people when you have the option. فَإِن تَقَدَّمُوا جَازَ, but if they themselves come forward to lead the prayer, it's valid. So for us, it's makruh to give them priority, but if they come forward to lead the prayer, it's pretty much okay. Your prayers are valid and they're acceptable, hopefully, inshallah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As Prophet Islam said, Sallu khalfa kulli barrin fajir, that pray behind every good and bad person. So there's no distinction or discrimination of whose salah will be accepted and whose won't. That is something only for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now let's talk about the congregation of women only. وَيُكْرَهُ لِلنِّسَاءِ أَن يُصَلِّينَ وَحْدَهُنَّ بِجَمَاعَةٍ. It is disapproved for women to pray in congregation by themselves. All women Jama'ah. That's what he's talking about. Because if you're like praying in Jama'ah, maybe in a mosque somewhere, right? It's not makruh. But to lead an all-woman prayer, creating a feminist mosque, maybe, right? So that is something which is disapproved of. And this is equal whether it's Farz prayer, Nafil prayer, Tarawih prayer, right? But in Salatul Janazah, like if there's a funeral prayer and you don't find any men available to lead, then there is no karaha in them actually praying in congregation. Now it's disapproved, but what if they choose to do so? What then? فإن فعلنا وقفت الإمامة وسطهن كالعراة. If they do pray, then the imam, she's going to stand between the people. She's going to stand at the place of the mu'adhin in the first row in between the people, as is the case of naked people. I mean, if it's a congregation of all naked people, you don't find a person with clothes to lead. And this one's happened with the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. They were traveling by sea and their boats fell. It's sunk. And when they got out of the water, because they didn't used to wear like sewed clothes like we do, right? They only had sheets that they used to wrap around themselves. It was easy for that to open within the tides of the water. And so by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's amr and his hukum, in order to teach us this masala, so what happened was that all of their clothes, all of their sheets, it got washed away. And so all of them were without clothes. And so what they did was they prayed with the imam standing between the others in the first row. He wasn't standing in front like normal. He'd stand in between. And when they told the Prophet Islam what had happened, he had approved of their method. And this is just so to make sure that the satar, the hukum of satar is achieved as much as possible. Now, when you are in jama'ah, how should you be standing? وَمَنْ صَلَّ مَعَ وَاحِدٍ أَقَامَهُ عَنْ يَمِينِهِ. If someone prays with only one other person with them, then that person, that muqtadi, should stand on the right side of the imam. His toes should be in the place where the imam's ankles are. You don't want to stand ankle to ankle because if any time in salah, the muqtadi steps in front of the imam, even by an inch or so, his salah will become invalid. So that's why the safest thing to do is to stand, to keep the muqtadi, to keep his toes in line to the ankle of the imam. So he always remains a few inches back. وَإِنْ كَانَ اثْنَيْنِ تَقَدَّمَهُمَا. And if it's two people that he's leading, two or more, then the imam should stand in front of both of them. وَلَا يَجُوزُ لِلرِّجَالِ أَنْ يَقْتَدُوا بِامْرَأَةٍ أَوْ صَبِيٍّ. It is not allowed for men to follow a woman in congregation, nor a minor. And there's a fitna that's still brewing. I don't know, it probably ended. It was in NYC in New York City. There was a masjid in which a woman started leading a prayer and without actually covering her hair or anything else, right? So remember that The deen, Islam is not personal. Like you don't get a personal Islam in which you change it however you like it. It has established laws and rules that must be followed in order for it to be known as Islam or the ahkam of Islam, right? It's not a social construct, it's not a personal construct. It's an actual religion. And so that fitna that's happening there, possibly in other parts of the earth, right? So avoid such masajid, such places of fitna, avoid such people, because the only thing that they're doing is placing your deen in danger. So anyhow, we were talking about how to make rows. وَيَصِفُ الرِّجَالُ ثُمَّ الصِّبْيَانُ ثُمَّ الْخُنْثَى ثُمَّ النِّسَاءُ. So in a congregational prayer, the imam, when forming the rows, will keep the rows of the men in front. Behind them will be minor children. Then behind those minor children will be the khuntha, uh, the hermaphrodites, and behind them will be the women. Now the khuntha is placed between the men and the women, right? And remember, by khuntha, we don't mean someone who feels like they're a man or feels like they're a woman, right? We actually refer to someone who has both forms of genitalia, and it's being impossible to biologically come to a conclusion whether they're male or whether they're female. And there's a whole chapter on khuntha in which the fuqaha have determined on what things to see, and they're mostly all biological, on how to decide whether this person is a man or a woman. And in very rare cases, what happens is that you're unable to decide in which category they fit in. And by khuntha, we refer to them as that. We're not talking about just any effeminate men, femboys, as social media might call them, or things like that. We mean people who actually have both sets of genitalia, and you don't find any other biological signs which can help you determine whether they should be considered men or women. So their stuff comes in between them because they might be men, might be males, so they should be standing in front. If they turn out to be females, the salah of all the males beside them is going to become invalid, right? And if they stand in the rows of the females, if they turn out to be men, then their own salah will become invalid. And so to avoid that problem, their saf is made between the two. Now, Islam has given a lot of power to women, right? And so in the jama'ah, in the congregation prayer, a woman has the power to actually invalidate the salah of any man if she wants to. And this is known as masalatul muhadat. And that's what we're talking about next. فإن قامت امرأة إلى جنب رجل مشتركان في صلاة واحدة فسدت صلاته. If a woman stands next to a man in a congregational prayer, and they're both praying the same salah, then the man's prayer becomes void. Then the man's prayer becomes void, right? So this is masalatul muhadat. Now, this masala has a few conditions. Number one, that the woman should be from Ahlul Shahwa, means that if she's just a minor girl, right, then that won't be mufsida. That's not going to negatively affect the male's salah. So she should be min Ahlul Shahwa, either a grown-up or a girl almost close to puberty. Second condition is that it should be a salat mutlaqa. It should be a salah with a ruku and sujood, which means that if she stands beside him in salatul janaza, this will not affect it. Third condition is that the salah should be mushtarakatun tahrimatan. That should be the same prayer behind the same imam. So if he's praying Zohar and she's praying Asr, his salah goes unaffected. But if they're both praying Asr, but they're praying behind different Aimma, or maybe he's praying individually and she's praying behind the Jannah, or vice versa, it's not going to affect his salah. So it should be the same. It should be this same salah behind the same imam, or at least the same salah. So if a woman comes and stands beside the imam, it's going to destroy the salah of the imam and those beside him as well, behind him as well. So that's one other condition. That is, the salah should be mushtarakatun, mushtarakatun tahrima. The other condition is, fourth condition, that the place should be the same. That's what he mentions here, if she stands beside him. If it's not the same, for example, he's on a higher ground and she's on a lower ground, in such a way that her head is below his feet, then it's not going to affect his salah. Or maybe opposite, that she's on a higher ground and he's on lower ground, such a way that her feet are above his head, then it's not going to affect his salah. Fifth condition is there's no separation between them. So maybe they're in the same field, but they have a satar between them, like a curtain or a chair that's separating them, right? Then in this case again, the salah remains unaffected. So there should not be any separation between the two. The sixth condition is that the imam should have made the intention of leading the women in prayer. That's necessary. So if you're like joining a congregation, which usually women normally don't, you have to make sure that the imam knows that behind him a woman is also praying. The imam has to actually make a special niyyah for him to lead women. For men, he doesn't have to make any niyyah, but if women are also praying behind an imam, he must make a niyyah for them, right? So that's one thing that you should remember. If you're going to a place in a congregation where you don't know whether or not women usually come or don't, you have to make sure that Imam knows beforehand that women are going to be praying behind him as well. So, in order for the congregation to be active, the Imam must make the intention, because if he doesn't, then the male salah goes unaffected, because their tahrima is not going to be the same, because her salah would not have been initiated with this jama anyways. So that was condition number 6. Condition number 7 includes this muhazat should be for an entire rukun, not just a few seconds doesn't matter. So it should be for an entire rukun, mean for the whole of the qiyam, she should be standing beside him with the conditions we just described, or in the entire ruku, or in the entire sujood. If it's not an entire rukun, a complete rukun, then the muhazat is ineffective. It doesn't affect her salah. And so this is for the men, that if a woman comes and stands beside you in a salatul janazah, in a normal salah, then move forward or backwards. Just don't be in line with them. And the last condition is that their jiha should also be the same. Now, this condition can only be understood if a person or if a congregation is being led inside the Kaaba. Because inside the Kaaba, every direction is the Qibla. Outside, you have to face towards the Kaaba, so usually there's only one direction. But inside the Kaaba, all the directions are Qibla, which means possible for one to be facing the north, the other south, one more east, and the other west. So if the jihad are different, for example, if the men are facing east and the women are facing north, for example, then the muhadath also doesn't work, even if they're standing beside each other, because their jihad, their direction is not the same. And so the direction should also be the same. So these are the 8 conditions that, if all of them are met, right, then if a woman stands beside a man in a congregation prayer, his salah becomes invalid. I'll just quickly go over the 8 of them. Number 1, she should be from Ahlul Shahwa. And number 2, it should be Salat Mutlaqa, ay Salat which has a ruku and sujood. Number 3, that the Salah should be uh, Mushtarakatun Tahrimatan, should be the same Salah behind the same Imam. Number 4, the place should be the same. Number 5, there should not be any hindrance between them. Number 6, the Imam should have made the intention of leading women in prayer. Number 7, this muhadat, the standing beside him, should be for an entire rukun. And by rukun, we mean a component of the salah. We discussed that already. And number 8, the direction in which they're praying should also be the same. And so this was a masalatul muhadat. Now some mutafarriqat relating to salatul jama'ah. ويكره للنساء حضور الجماعات ولا بأس بأن تخرج العجوز في الفجر والمغرب والعشاء عند أبي حنيفة رحمه الله تعالى. وقال أبو يوسف محمد رحمه الله تعالى خروج العجوز في سائر الصلوات يجوز. So it is disapproved for women, and by here we mean young women, to attend the congregation because of khawf of fitna. If there is the khawf of fitna, of harassment, etc., then it is makruh for them to go out for prayer. As for the elderly, according to Imam Abu Hanifa, in Fajr and Maghrib and Isha, it's not a problem. For them, according to the Imam, for the elderly women, attending the Asr and Dhuhr is also makruh. But according to the Sahibain, they say for elderly women, all of the salawat, it's acceptable for them to go and attend the prayer. And by elderly, we mean women who've reached an age and a physical condition in which generally nobody would be interested in them, right? White hair, wrinkles, and all other things that you could imagine. So basically, the illa behind is khawful fitna, right? But if it's a safe environment, and especially if there's like this culture of women attending the congregation, going to the mosque, for example, in Arab countries, especially in the Haramain, right? Like it's an established culture, women going to the mosque, then they should not be stopped. Let it go. But if in fact you're in a place where the culture is that women usually don't attend the congregation, then they shouldn't be encouraged to do so, and they shouldn't make a habit of going to. Right? If you're outside for work, uh, you're out shopping, going visiting somewhere, in the middle of your journey, it's time for salah. Obviously, you need to go to pray, right? That's something you can't avoid. And so the masajid, the mosque, should have a place separate for women. But if there's not a culture in any area, in any society, of them attending the congregation, they should not be encouraged and they should not form a habit. But there should be designated areas for it, because if they're out of their house for another reason and the time of prayer comes, they can easily find somewhere that they can pray. So although you can see the ibadah saying that it's disapproved for women to attend congregation, but remember this is only where the society is not accustomed to it. If the society is accustomed to it, which usually means that the masala of fitna, the problem of fitna, will be dealt with. There should have been already measures placed in order to avoid that problem. That's not a problem. But if there really is a fitna, you're seeing cases of harassment, of assaults rising, that even if in your society, if there is a culture of women attending the prayer, then they should avoid it. Because that was the original reason why uh, the Fuqaha of Ahnaf said that they should avoid praying in congregation in the first place. And also, for men, like we mentioned previously, that they get 25 to 27 times more ajr when praying in congregation. For the women, actually, it's the opposite of that. And so the Prophet Islam in the hadith, he said, Salatul mar'a fi baytiha khayrun min salatil mar'a salatiha fil masjid. That a woman's prayer in her house is much better than her prayer in the masjid. And her prayer in a hidden room in the house or in a room inside the house is much better than her prayer in the open area of the house. Right? So the more she's hidden when praying, the better it is for her, the more ajr that she would get. And so keeping that in mind, so although it may be allowed for her to attend the congregation, it does not necessarily mean that it's the best option for her. Also, same goes when making the sufuf. For the men, you get more ajr if you stand in the rows which are closer to the imam, the first, the second, the third. But for women, it's actually the opposite. So if they're praying in congregation, they get more ajr standing in the latter rows. Standing in this last row, the second last row, that's more of an ajr than trying to stand in front. Now we're going to talk about uh, Salatul Ma'zur, the salat behind people who have some sort of condition, some sort of excuse. ولا يصلي الطاهر خلف من به سلس البول ولا الطاهرة خلف المستحاضة. Someone in the state of purity is not allowed to pray behind someone with urinary inconsistency. Someone who keeps having drops of urine exit their body without finding the time to able to get that to stop, make a complete wudu, and then pray the farz of the time. Similarly, a pure woman cannot pray behind a woman suffering from chronic menstrual bleeding, istihaza, for the same reason. وَلَا الْقَارِئُ خَلْفَ الْأُمِّي. Neither a person who knows how to read the Quran, they cannot pray behind a person who is illiterate in reading the Quran, who doesn't know how to read it. وَلَا الْمُقْتَسِي خَلْفَ الْعُرْيَانِ. Similarly, a clothed person cannot pray behind a naked person. Because in all of these cases, uh, the Imam is in a weaker state than the Muqtadi. And since Imam is the one who leads the prayer, their state should be both physically and in terms of fulfilling the conditions of the Salah. The Imam should be in a much stronger state than the Muqtadi should. Right? So that's why if someone is facing any excuse, whether an excuse affecting the condition of tahara or the excuse affecting the condition of covering the aura, right? Or an excuse affecting the component of qira'ah, for example, then such people should be avoiding praying behind, and that such people should not be made prayer leaders. ويجوز أن يؤم المتيمم المتوضئين والماسح الخفين الغاسلين. But someone who has done tayammum can lead those who have actually done wuzu, and someone who has wiped over their khuf, their leather socks, can actually lead those who wash their feet. Because making tayammum when you don't have access to water, or when you cannot use water, is not the same as praying behind a person who doesn't find any clothes to wear or a person with the chronic bleeding. Because tayammum is a sharia given substitute for wuzu when you cannot perform it. And mas'al al-khuffayn, wiping over your khufs, is permitted by sharia as a substitute for washing your feet all year long. And since it's not a condition that the sharia has placed, or in the first case, that it's a substitute that the sharia itself has given, these things don't act as a hindrance for a person to be leading the salah, right? ويصلي القائم خلف القائد ولا يصلي الذي يركع ويسجد خلف المؤمن. Also, a person who is standing may pray behind someone who sits. Someone who's sitting but can actually perform the ruku and sujood. But the person who can perform ruku and sujood cannot pray behind someone who uses gestures to perform the ruku and sujood. So the qiyam, although a component necessary if you're able to stand, is not a part of salah in itself. It's actually just a means to an end. It's a means to perform the ruku and the sujood. And that's why you see that in the nafil prayer, the qiyam is not necessary. Even though you can stand, you're quite able to stand, you're allowed to actually sit down and pray initially. You can't do that in farz, you can do that in nafil, which tells us that even though in farz and wajib salah, the qiyam is counted as a component, in itself, it does not have the same status as ruku and sujood. So that's why if a person is unable to stand and they lead the prayer while sitting down, performing the ruku and sujood completely, then they can lead people healthy enough to stand. And that's what the Prophet Islam did at the end of his lifespan. When he was very sick, he used to sit down and lead the prayer. The Sahaba behind him were actually standing, right? But if a person's praying through gestures, then in this case, a person who's able to actually perform ruku and sujood cannot pray behind them. ولا يصلي المفترض خلف المتنفل ولا من يصلي فرضا خلف من يصلي فرضا آخر. A person performing the obligatory prayers cannot pray behind someone's performing the nafil prayers. Similarly, a person performing one obligatory prayer, let's say Asr, cannot pray behind someone praying a different obligatory prayer, let's say Zohar, for example. So a muftaris, a faras prayer, cannot be prayed behind a nafil prayer because the faras is stronger than the nafil, and the imam should always be stronger. Similarly, one faras cannot be performed behind another faras simply because both of them, although in strength being faras, they're the same, but the kind of strength is different. The intention made for the prayer is different, and you should be following the Imam in all aspects, ranging from all of the actions that he does, including the intention that he's made. So if your Imam is doing Dhuhr and you're doing Asr, you're not in the same salah. And so that's why it's impossible for one muftaris to be behind another muftaris. But the opposite for the mutanaffil and muftaris is true. وَيُصَلِّي الْمُتَنَفِّلْ خَلْفَ الْمُفْتَرِزِ, that a person who is praying the nafil can actually pray behind a person who is praying a farz prayer, except for Maghrib. You can't do that in Maghrib. Why? Because there is no nafil salah which is of 3 units. Nafil salah happen in increments of 2, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and however you want. They cannot happen in odd numbers. So Maghrib because it's 3 units, and Witr as well because it's 3 units. A mutanafil cannot pray behind such a person. In other salawat, it's acceptable as long as they haven't prayed their farz prayer. Because if someone has already prayed their farz, then they cannot join another congregation with the intention of nafil in Asr as well, or in Fajr as well. But if they haven't prayed their own farz salah and they join in with the intention of nafil, then that's possible.